Thank you, Daniel, for agreeing to be interviewed for Next Generation AGR Refugee Voices, ahead of the publication of your book, Hitler, Stalin, Mom and Dad. Congratulations on your book, first
Thank
of
you
all.
very much indeed.
I'm particularly pleased that I can interview you today because I was very fond of your parents and interviewed them both for Refugee Voices, as you know. So I think let's start with your book, which you've just signed off, and it's in production. So just tell me, how do you feel about it?
Oh, I'm very excited to tell their story. There was a moment when I went to the Wiener Library, which is connected to my mother's story, and I heard my father on a pair of headphones in a refugee exhibition. And I realised it was a short audio clip, so I asked the Wiener Library to send it to me, and I put it in a drawer because I just heard it, so I didn't need to hear it again. And about 6 months later, I thought it'd be nice to hear Dad's voice again. So I got the disc out of the drawer and I put it in a CD player, and it wouldn't play. And it was very irritating because, they'd sent it to me and it didn't play. And then I looked at it carefully and I thought, oh, it's not actually a CD. They put it on a DVD. How odd. So I put it in the DVD player and up popped my father. And it wasn't 2 minutes of audio as I thought, but 4 hours of him talking about his story, an amazing experience. So first of all, I had that immense emotion of seeing my father, whom I love very dearly, talking. And that was an incredible experience in itself. But after that, I realised that even though we'd spoken a lot about his experiences, my parents were very open about what they'd experienced. And even though I'd actually written about both my parents, I'm a journalist, I'd written about both my parents' stories in different ways in the newspaper for articles, and for that I'd taken notes. Despite that, there was really a lot of detail that I hadn't got. And I think, had I not put that DVD in the DVD player that day, but really, had you not interviewed my father, I'm not sure that it would have been possible for me to tell my parents' story in the way that I did. So I've told the story, interlocking stories, so it goes back and forward between my mother and my father's story. Part of it, I think, is an attempt to capture the universality of the refugee and oppressive experience and the oppression that they faced. There are some things that I think are of interest to all refugees, however they've been made refugees, just the difficulty of their life, not the life and death things, but having no money, or the fact that my grandfather is in one place and his socks somewhere else. That sort of small detail of it. But obviously, the other thing it does, the commonality between the Nazi and communist oppressions, I think, does emerge very clearly. And despite the fact that we know so much about my mother's story, I don't mean the specifics of my mother's story, which are rather special, but the general story of the Holocaust, we know so much less. And I had lunch today with a highly intelligent man, works in the field of racism. Liked him immensely, and I thought he was very well informed. He'd not heard of Katyn, which is obviously one of the incidents in the book that took away one of my father's friends.
Just tell us a little bit, because otherwise for the viewer it doesn't make sense. Just tell us the story of your
course.
parents, just very briefly.
Absolutely.
That we understand.
My mother was born in 1933 in Charlottenburg, Berlin. She was the daughter of one of the leaders of the Jewish community in Germany, Alfred Wiener, who was the syndicus or the general secretary of something called the CV, the Zentralverein, an organisation that represented Jews in Germany. And as part of Alfred's work, his name was Alfred Wiener, he had begun to build an archive of material about the Nazis. Ultimately was going to be used in the Nuremberg trials and in the Eichmann trials, but it was a threat to the Nazis while they were active. And one of the things that happened is he had to leave Germany, go to Holland, and from Holland, eventually, because he was thought to endanger their neutrality, he came to Britain. While he was here, the Germans invaded Holland. My mother was trapped and she ended up in Belsen. But her story is one of miraculous survival. She's one of a tiny number of people who end up being exchanged because Alfred had managed to obtain for them citizenship of Paraguay. And anybody who wants to learn more about that will probably have to read the book because it's too detailed to explain now. But she met my father in London in 1956, and my father was born the only son of a very rich parent of Adolf or Dolu Finkelstein, who ran a huge company. He was known as the Iron King of Lvov. That was his nickname. And as you'll be aware, when the Nazis came in into Poland from one end, the Soviets, with a sort of ruse, came in from the other end. And the deal in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, they took Lvov. They annexed it, creating a sort of fake election, turned it into Soviet Ukraine, then began to arrest people. My grandfather, being a city councillor, being a leading Jew, being very wealthy, was obviously on their list. He disappears one day, is taken to the Gulag, sentenced to 8 years of hard labour. And a few days later, they come arrest my, at that point, 10-year-old father and his mother, and the two of them are sent to a state collective farm on the border of Siberian borders in Kazakhstan. But fortunately for them, but unfortunately for the rest of the family, Hitler then invaded the Soviet Union. They did a deal between the Soviets, therefore, and the British, which involved the Poles also doing a deal with the Soviets. The Soviet prisoners are released, the Polish prisoners in the Soviet Union are released, and they are ultimately, in quite unlikely circumstances, reunited. They join something called the Anders Army, go through the Soviet Union to Iran, from Iran to Palestine, and eventually with the Polish Resettlement Corps they came here. My parents eventually met each other, bought a house in Hendon and never left. And when my mother died, she did it in her bed, as she would have wished to, in Hendon Central. And that is their story, very rapidly done. But if anyone's Hitler, Stalin, Mum and Dad has a longer account.
Okay. And obviously the interviews, I remember them very, very vividly, both of them. Your father more reluctant to speak. I think it was first we interviewed your mother, but then he...
So interestingly, my parents were very open with me about the whole thing, and they always would answer questions, and they would sometimes talk about it unprompted. Mostly it was prompted because they didn't want to bore anyone. I think there was a hilarious reason. But interestingly, I don't think my father told me that he'd done that interview. I was aware of you because he spoke of you in glowing terms quite often, but I wasn't aware of the origin of that, and I didn't know that he'd done it. Now, it may be I was so busy living my life I didn't listen when he told me he'd done it, but I don't think he did tell me, and obviously it was a tremendous pleasure and privilege to discover he'd done it.
And it wasn't, I mean, even I remember, it's an unusual story, and people don't know about it, about the hardship of the Gulag and how they survived. So that's all in your book.
Do you know, it is, but you say it's an unusual story. It happened to hundreds of thousands of people. And actually, the way that I put it about the book, my mother's is a highly unusual version of a standard Holocaust story. But it's a highly unusual story. Yes. But everyone knows that story. But they don't know the highly unusual version of my mother's, how it happened that she came to be free and all those things. My father's story, it happened to lots and lots of people. People just don't know it. I think what was good, and you said this to me, my father had an immense recall of detail. I used to joke about how my grandmother would introduce herself to the driver of the bus to Golders Green, but my father would then remember the name for 30 years. He had an extraordinary recollection. And I recall this in the book when we did a quiz once where the question was, what is the inscription? No, it wasn't. It was, what year was Admiralty Arch built? My brother knew the year off the top of his head. I hadn't got a clue, by the way. My father confirmed that it was true by reciting the whole of the inscription in Latin, translating it, and then telling me that my brother was correct. He wasn't doing it to show off either. That's what he was like. He could remember. He had an amazing recollection.
That brings me to my next question about memory. You start the beginning of your book with a quote from your grandfather, Dr. Alfred Wiener, which says, "I'm prepared to forget as long as everyone else remembers." So I want to know, why did you choose to remember now? And how...
So there are some contingent reasons. I sat still long enough because of COVID to actually get going and produce reach critical mass. That's definitely one reason why it happened.
So time.
Time, and and it just fitted. It was just a moment, and for a long time and then another contingent reason. Somebody approached me and asked to be my agent, and I felt embarrassed that I hadn't got anything to. I'd helped with David Cameron in a book, and also with a football player who wanted to do a book, and my agent had negotiated those, and then those projects had come to fruition, and now I needed, now he was waiting for something else. So I felt it was something that I sort of had to do because it was embarrassing to have an agent and no product. Sorry, but of course there were bigger reasons. I felt that whereas 15 years ago it would be impossible to imagine the things that happened to my parents happening to my children, I don't think I could be so confident about that now. I don't think it will. But do I think that liberal, law-abiding democracy, the rule of law, is something that we can be certain of? No, I'm not sure I do. I think that I've come to appreciate that people are more insouciant about it than I thought, and that it's, as it's gone away before, it could again. I think in this country is relatively immune from that, but it's not completely immune like anywhere in the world. And, if you look at the United States, probably the most important force for democratization in the 20th century, it's in quite a lot of trouble. Yeah. And you've got to look at that and think, well, okay, I think this story does need to be told now. So there was a political impetus to it, definitely.
So is there a political message then in that case?
Well, yeah. I suppose at the end of the book, I said that my parents had two different experiences, and my father was not really asked to recall his, except by you, very often. But they processed their experiences in the same way, in that they processed it in a personal way. The personal way was they were determined not to be victims and not to see themselves as victims. They realised that they were, in an objective sense. They didn't object to other people doing so, but for them, they weren't denying other people's victimhoods, but for them, they felt the liberating thing was to move on. And my mother was very keen that survivor not be her identity. She was a survivor, and she was willing to acknowledge it and work with other survivors. She did a lot of Holocaust education, but it wasn't the primary thing. And she certainly never wanted me to see myself a second generation survivor, right? I think she would regard that as a failure if I saw myself in quite that way. So I think that was and they both saw it in that way, definitely saw it in that way. But they also had a political thing. So first of all of their children are very engaged in public life. My sister's a permanent secretary in the civil service. My brother's been chief scientific advisor for national security. He's the president of a university, and I've been involved in politics and journalism, tried to be a public voice for the things that I believe in. And that's because you can't say, if you've had our experience, that politics doesn't matter, because politics killed my grandmother, and it stole my parents' home, and it exiled my grandfather and took away his nationality, and it took away all of his books and stole every piece of cutlery and soft furnishings that we possessed. It had a good attempt to starve everyone to death, and we've all ended up as exiles. So anybody who says politics doesn't matter, we are Exhibit A. It definitely does matter. I always remember being in school struggling with the argument, why am I more interested in politics than the other kids? And now I kind of realise why that was, and I would feel much more able to justify that. I've very much, so there was that. But there's also a particular type of politics. So we're for the rule of law, for moderation and proportion. We accord an important place to human rights. We are, which my grandfather, by the way, wasn't. We're supporters of a state of Israel for Jews. we believe in a multicultural society, but we're very attached to our national identity. All those things are definitely part from my parents' experiences.
So you think that is direct?
Yeah. So some of these things are. I'm sorry. This is it. Some of these things are bits that are directly from my father's teaching or my mother's teaching, and other things are things I've gleaned from understanding their story.
So what I find interesting, the idea about being a public figure in politics. For my I'm second generation parent survivors. The message was very much stay out of, do not be a public person. It's too dangerous. So it's interesting because you can take the opposite message.
Yes.
Politics is dangerous. Do not, keep a low profile. Do not speak up.
The truth of it is that both my parents, to be fair to them, were involved in, both my grandparents on both sides, the grandfathers were involved in politics, but politics came to them. They didn't go looking for it. So I wish it was a protection that people weren't involved in politics. But my mother's aunt, she wasn't involved in politics at all, and she died in Sobibor. So it was. I kind of get that idea, but first of all, I sort of object to the idea that I might be put off from being in public life. But secondly, it wasn't. So what's an interesting thing about my mother's story is that in 1940, when Holland is invaded, they'd had this library in Holland. Most of it had moved, but Greta, my grandmother, was worried that people would know who Alfred Weiner was and they would come for him. So they unscrewed the nameplate and they burnt a lot of documents when it first happened. But what then happens is that the Nazis don't come for him, and actually they just get arrested like everyone else in the end. And so it wasn't because Alfred was involved in politics. It wasn't because he'd gone around the country trying to warn people against Hitler. It wasn't because he had this archive. It was just because he was Jewish, or that they were.
Yeah, which is interesting.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, the other thing you said now and you write in the book is about your parents not being defined by being survivors. And I think that's really interesting. And again, it brings me to the second generation. You see, do you feel, you said your mother didn't like the idea of second generation, but first of all, would you consider yourself second generation? Do you think it's a useful category for a number of people at all?
I never use that term, but the other thing, I'm sure my mum would agree with me, is I never argue about what people would like to call themselves or how they'd like to regard themselves. I don't want to quibble with other people. It's not some sort of competition. If people feel that, then I'm very happy to accept them on their own terms. It's just not how I think of myself. I'm sure that my mother didn't think other people shouldn't think of themselves as second generation. She wasn't dismissive of anybody. That's what her character was. And I'm not either. It's just not how I think of myself. I definitely have been, and it's obvious to me, I'm profoundly influenced by what happened to my parents. My politics makes no sense whatsoever without an understanding that. And one of the reasons I wanted to write the book was for that reason. It explains an awful lot. I'm thinking of an article for tomorrow in my newspaper, and I know that comes directly from my parents' experience. Is all about the rule of law and things like that, and it's a very frequent theme of mine. So it's not a good. I do not regard it as a useful description of me. But two things. One is clearly the fact that I'm the child of two refugees. And they had that experience and came to this country unquestionably influences my politics, and I frequently reference it. So if you want to call it second generation, you can.
Is there a better word?
I don't feel I've never had a need for it, and I've never had a need to use it. That's all I'm saying. But that's the second point, which is I'm so super cool with other people using it. They're my lovely friends and I embrace them in our common experience, and I'd be the last person to say, don't call yourself this, or you shouldn't be that, or, you know, it's like people have this ludicrous thing as who is a Holocaust survivor, right? And I haven't got no mum didn't have any time for that, and I've got no time for it either, right?
But culturally moved, you know, which is really interesting, because post-war, survivor was really reserved for concentration camp survivors.
Yeah.
And you can feel that has moved and moved and moved.
Mum had this great phrase which she always used, which is not a competition, right? Because she actually used to always say that, you know, my father had been on a train for longer than her, right? Because she'd been on this horrible train between Westerbork and Belsen, which was objectively terrible. It was so hot, and they were all in these many layers of clothing to keep the clothing, so it was insufferable, actually. And my father had been on a horrendous journey, which had taken 3 weeks. And every time my mother told the story about her own experience, which had taken some hours, she would always say, you know, Ludwig's was worse, right? And that's very typical of her as a personality, and I kind of share it, but it's more a description of her personality than it is of the experience.
There's another term, I don't know whether you've come across it, it's called post-memory. And there's a scholar, which is kind of interesting, in America, she's called Marianne Hart, and she came up with this idea of the post-memory of the second and third generation. So, and what it means is that you have a relationship to that history. I kind of like that
Of course,
term.
we've all got it.
So
We're all
positions you somewhere.
Yeah, we're all the subject of our DNA and our genes and our histories, and I'm totally relaxed about it. So I've not found the term particularly valuable in my own description to people about things. I've never felt that I couldn't explain myself without using that term, and I never use it. But that's not because it's just not. It's not because it was. It's not because it's a bad term or people shouldn't use it or it's a bad category. It's just not what I use particularly. And mum, I tell you what, mum didn't like about it. Mum didn't like about it for us, right? Not in general. She just felt she wanted us to live as normal life, forward facing into the country we were born in. You know, one with the modern world. She didn't want her own experiences to be visited on me. She didn't want us to wallow in the misery of her, you know, of her own oppression, and that's not what she survived for, right? That's her view.
But you know, so I think many people felt like that, but nevertheless, now, you know, we have lots of second, third generation who feel all kinds of things, and some of them now with the whole citizenship, of course, right, which is a different
I completely, you know? I have no argument whatsoever with how anyone else wants to feel. I can only speak for myself, and I don't do that in a spirit ever of criticism of other people's experiences, because everybody had terrible experiences and we're all brothers and sisters in arms, you know. That's what I think.
I guess some people, second, third generation, there's a lot, I think, in England about not speaking on silence, and that wasn't your experience, wasn't my experience either.
No.
And I think that helps a lot.
There was a lot, so I do understand that, and I think that did help an awful lot. And one of the reasons I've told my parents' story is because I could. And I on my father's story, I had a lot of help with. So my in a suitcase in my parents' office when they died, I found a bag full of indecipherable letters. They were Polish. I worked, right, and there were 90 of them, and I then found that there was some people in America who were friends of some relations of mine who lived there, who they had lost relatives in the Polish deportation, and they felt very moved by it, and I was helping to tell their story by telling mine, so they were willing to help with it. They were willing to help me with the translation, and that was invaluable, because I couldn't even read them. Because the thing about the German is that you can read it, then you can put it into, you can use Google Translate to at least find out what it is, then you can get a translator after that. With the Polish, you couldn't even read it. Okay. So anyway, we all have different ways of remembering, and we all have a different experience of it. And I told this story partly because my parents did talk to me and I did know what happened. And so the book is written for my parents, and for all the readers who don't know anything about it and had nothing to do with it, but also for everybody who had a similar experience. Oh, and for one other group of people as well, people in this country who had the trauma of their relatives liberating Belsen, of which there are an amazing number who often write to me. And for them, I hope they'll discover what Belsen was and why what happened to people there happened.
So speaking of trauma, which is interesting, so I find the tone of your book, the tone is not that of trauma and dislocation, but of change, of a life changed, of a new life started, which is interesting, and that of course makes it different maybe from other books.
Look, it's written in the spirit of my parents, not because I did it that deliberately, but because they're my parents and So what's so fascinating, I mean, there are lots of things, is that you find out a lot of the time how many attitudes. I have no doubt, my grandfather got himself into many political arguments and I read about them. And I have no doubt in each occasion that I would have taken his side in those particular disputes, even when he wasn't right. I would have made the same mistakes. And then I found my grandmother's PhD, and her topic was basically a critique of over-ideological free marketeers from a free market perspective. That is such a niche political position, and it happens also to be mine. But I knew nothing about her PhD.
Which university? Where did she go?
It was the university.
Yeah, so you're saying you see similarities with your.
Yeah,
with your
I'm just saying
grandmother.
that. Yeah, I'm just saying that. So this is even. There's an awful lot that's similar. So the book is written with my parents' attitude, and my parents' attitude was definitely very forward-facing, quite phlegmatic about what had happened to them. I mean, my father did feel very deeply about it. Both my parents did. My father, I think I might even say even more, maybe. But and it was objectively, you can see that it was quite traumatic when you read about it. And in my mother's case, I definitely had the more that I found some newspaper cuttings of people who'd seen what must have been my mother, as well as a small group of 100 other people coming off a train just after she was released from the camp. And when you read it, you realised how close to death they all were, and that was pretty shocking to me because of the way that my mother always talked about it. Was never like that. I mean, she never dramatised. She under-dramatised what happened to her.
So you, in a way, took on her narrative.
Yeah, no, but I, it's definitely influenced the way that I've seen it. But I mean, when you read her story, you realise it was every bit as terrible as you would imagine it was. But it's just that she was so incredibly sort of philosophical about it, and also so determined that we wouldn't be thrown by it. I'm sure she felt that it was it would be her victory over what had happened to her. She was not going to let it spoil her life, and she was not going to let it spoil my life. Right? Yeah, that was absolutely what she was going to do. She wasn't going to, it happened when she was young, and she'd come to this country. She'd married my dad. They were very, very, very happy together. They had a lovely life, and she was determined that was how she was going to think of herself.
But do you think sometimes a way of doing it is actually not to talk too much in detail? You see.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Because I find, I tell you from my book, my parents, my mother spoke a lot. But now, thinking what I found, photographs, letters, and I find my knowledge was actually not that detailed, because the detail is quite terrible. But if you kind of talk about in bigger things, you can create that sort of narrative.
Yeah, yes, I'm sure that's true. I think there was probably also an element that she told me a lot of these stories when I was quite young, and then she also spoke to a lot of schools where she was definitely trying to tell them a story which they could understand, but without horrifying them too much. And there's no doubt about it. When I was actually, fun enough, reading this last night, when in Westerbork, as you'll be aware, every Tuesday there were these transports. And so on Monday night, they would read the list out in each of the barracks as to people who were going to be deported to the east. And they both did and didn't know what was going to happen. I mean, they really did, but they also denied it to themselves and all that. But it was horrendous, this. And I then realised this must have gone on every week for, a year. Or not, actually, no, I'm sorry, I apologise, because they were in seven months, right? So that is a horrendous thing, and my mother didn't talk about that.
This is what I mean. It's because I find when you really think about those details, they are terrible, and there's no way around it. But
yes.
maybe,
So there was lots of reasons. Yeah. There may be lots of reasons for that, why she didn't go into those details. But I definitely think one of them was she didn't want that to dominate her life. I think that was very important.
So just tell us a little bit about your childhood in Hendon.
Yeah, so we just, my parents lived in Hendon all their life, really, and and I was thinking this because, when I used to have asthma when I was a kid, and so then, I'd get out of bed and Mum would look after me and give me some medication or whatever it would be, Vicks, whatever the thing they used, and she would read me Kings and Queens of England, right? And I was very fan. It was my beginning for my interest in history and all that. What's so interesting about that is it only later occurred to me they weren't really, the kings and queens of the time. Like Queen Elizabeth, one of my heroes from that time. My parents weren't here either family, but they were somewhere else, right? There've been kings and queens in other countries, right? So it's quite. But we lived a standard childhood in this country. My grandmother got some recompense, interestingly enough, from the Germans.
Your Polish Jewish grandmother.
Even though they'd actually been victims of the communists, but they got restitution, and with that restitution, my grandmother paid, and my parents bought a house, and my grandmother paid for half of our education. So we went to a private, even though my mum was a teacher and my dad was an academic, certainly nowadays it'd be very hard for them to afford to do that. But the restitution money helped to do that. It was a very bookish household. Again, very much like my grandparents, but it was Jewish, so some people I think were pushed away from religion by the experiences they'd had. My mother was never pushed away from it. My mother never believed in a supernatural God before or afterwards or at any point. So her view was God didn't let that happen, people made it happen. So it didn't reduce her, it didn't affect her faith in it. But my father felt the same, but he was incredibly intellectually interested in Judaism in a funny way. That hadn't been the case all of his life, but he met my grandfather, my mother's father, Alfred Wiener, and my mother's father was incredibly interested in that. His hobby really was reading about Judaism, and that became my father's hobby as well.
And I think your father did a degree.
My father then did a PhD.
In his retirement.
Yes, his hobby was the progressive rabbinate of 19th century Warsaw. Mine was football. They were slightly different things.
So you're simulated.
Yeah, so that's an interesting thing. So that's a very interesting point, by the way. I'm sure that part of the reason that my dad had absolutely no interest in films, pop music, or even music, actually, not of any kind, and no interest in kind of pop football or popular culture was not just because he was a refugee, but because he had no teenage years at all. I'm sure part of it was just who he was, right? So, there are lots of people in this country who had perfectly good teenage years, but aren't in those things either. But they definitely were part of the reason. So I definitely got interests that, of course, relate to living here, which would have been incomprehensible to my grandfather or my father.
What about, you said, so she talked about the Queens. What were the remnants there of the continental, apart from the books?
The cuisine, obviously. I remember we had something in the hall.
Yeah.
It was a telephone directory which you moved the little thing and then it popped up like that, and we called it the clopper, right? The telephone clopper. And I remember once saying this to a school friend who didn't know what I was talking about, and it slowly realised it was. Maybe it wasn't German. I don't know what language it was or where it came from. My parents both spoke a lot of languages, and they had so there were certain continental phrases we'd use that other people wouldn't, and obviously we had continental food which I didn't appreciate was continental,
Like
goulash, for example, or I'm trying to think of other things that my mother made that were pierogi was dumplings that my grandmother made, or schnitzels, and kind of tongue, which is slightly, that's a bit more, there's a British sort of thing too. But they were definitely, another thing, this is pretty interesting. So my mother made something she called risotto, right? Well, what this actually was fried rice with whatever was chicken usually. And I absolutely loved it. Right? So, to the point where when I actually one day was served a risotto, I found it very disappointing, right? Actual risotto I'm not that fond of. My mother's risotto I really loved because I like fried rice basically. And when I was researching the book, I came across a piece of paper which was obviously in my mother's handwriting, and I was trying to translate it. And eventually I thought, that word is definitely omelette. So then I sent it to somebody to translate it for me. And it turned out that my grandmother had written down in Belsen lots of recipes. And I'm sure that the reason for that was not to retain some family folklore, because it wouldn't make sense for that to be the reason. What it was that people were talking about food. I know this from a lot of my research into Belsen in general. People talked about food the whole time, and what she was doing was writing down the food to remember it. Anyway, when I said to the translator, she said, one thing I'm a bit confused about is the use of this risotto that's in this list, because people didn't have risotto at that time, right? Anyway, I looked at the risotto recipe and it was fried rice. Right, so that is where my mother got it, and somehow they got this term that used it, and she called it risotto. So there you go, that's linked with that.
But there's all the children who basically believe what their parents tell them and have no idea.
Completely.
Same thing about the accent you mentioned in the book. You didn't know that your mother.
Yeah. Well, my sister had that experience where someone said to her, "Where does your mum come from?" And as far as she was concerned, it was like, well, Cheney Walk, Hendon, obviously. But it was only as we got older that we sort of began to realise they didn't come from there, in quotation marks.
You didn't feel that? Did you feel any loss or absence or kinds of...
No, I didn't. My parents worked very hard. They didn't want us to feel like the last remnants of a dying continental culture. I think my grandfather, my mother's father, definitely did feel that. But he was much older, obviously. But my father and my mum were determined not to feel that, but definitely in their whole interests and outlook, that definitely was part of it.
What about their friends, for example?
Yeah, so all their friends, almost all their friends were, in fact, refugees.
Yeah.
I didn't, lots of them would change names and stuff. I didn't know. I just discovered it afterwards. They had very few of, I suppose, conventional friends that you would meet sort of ordinarily, and I do remember they had a friend who was a Scottish Labour MP who'd become a Lord. My parents thought that was great that he was a Lord, and he came round to dinner. I remember Lord Howie of Troon. And I met him. I was then in the House of Lords with him, which was quite nice. He was very old. He's no longer alive now, but. And I remember that mainly because it was so odd that they had a friend who came round who was who was British and by birth and not Jewish, and it was one of those dinner parties that I met my in-laws.
Okay.
And I married their daughter.
Okay. Yeah. So because I think again other people find themselves in a situation where they don't quite realise that all the friends or that they themselves are second, third generation. Yeah, they didn't actually know that it's
my father. My father was very open and professionally he had lots of. He worked in the mining research establishment. He went down the mines. He was a university academic. He always had lots of friends who he personally, professional friends who were born in Britain and who, that was their background, but went for socialising.
Yeah, really interesting. You're in an unusual situation, and so far that your grandfather really founded an institute,
Yes.
to chronicle history, to fight against anti-Semitism. Where do you see your legacy? Let's talk about Holocaust education in general. How do you feel you should continue that?
Oh, yeah, okay, so that's interesting. So when my mother so this is another impetus for the book. When my mother had began to do schools, a particularly moving thing where she went. George Osborne invited her to Number 10 Downing Street to talk to his kids because he wanted them to meet a Holocaust survivor, and it was, it made an impression on them, and George absolutely loved it, and my mother obviously loved going to Number 10 to do that.
When was that?
Must have been 2015, I think. Maybe it was a little bit old. Maybe it was a little bit earlier actually, because it was maybe just after the Olympics. But during their period in office, so they really. My mother told all these stories and stuff like that. But when she became too ill, and one of the last ones she did was at my son's school, and she became really too ill to do them anymore. And I thought, well, I'm going to have to do them. So my sister and myself, and to a lesser extent, just because of time, my brother, who's just as committed as the rest of us, but have taken that up, and we do it. And I'm hoping, to use the book to supercharge that and do it in the best way. But I've done much media on it, and I'll tend to accept. I have a lot of invitations to do different things because of my job, and I can't accept all of them. So I've got to have some sort of prioritization, and Holocaust Memorial is one of the things that I'll do.
So do you think you could envisage your book being used in schools? Or
I hope so. Look, so one of the things that I discussed with HarperCollins, who are the publishers in this country, was maybe doing a young adult version. But certainly I'd like to do it in schools. And the other thing that I'm sure that would work very well is to try to use the interviews that you did and as part of talks for my sister or for myself.
Yeah. Well, there's that group, Generation to Generation, where they are trying to have.
Yeah, I think it's amazing.
I don't know what you think about it.
It's terrific. It's a terrific effort.
It's a great idea.
Yeah. I mean, it's terrific because the important thing about it is not only of the first generation of Holocaust of people who were victims of the Holocaust now dying, obviously, and not all of them, but they are, or they're too ill to give talks. But even I'm 60. And so obviously we're going to have to make sure that we pass that on. So my son was very involved in the book. My oldest son was very involved in the production of this book, and actually my middle son also helped me with some of the scanning of the documents. I've tried to involve them all in it a bit.
Do you feel that they'll take this on?
Yeah, so I'm sure they will. My son, but particularly my oldest son, is really very interested in it. He's interested in Judaism, and he's interested in the history, and they definitely all feel it's something that they have to do.
And what do you think? So we have collected all these testimonies, like your parents, in the world. Probably, I'm sure the Shaw Foundation 52,000. Other archives. Maybe we have. I don't know. Nobody's counted all the testimonies. What do you think should happen? They are, they're sitting in archives in libraries worldwide.
Well,
that's where they are.
Yeah, and look. Some of them will sit there and people won't review them, but they'll also be there when people need to have them. I mean, I'm sure that when I reviewed the minutes of the meeting between Jim Callaghan and my father, Jim Callaghan, the former British Prime Minister, and my grandfather, I was probably the first person to look at that document in years, so it's in an archive and people don't necessarily use it, but then sometimes they do. And then my career really has been about popularising information which I read, so you don't have to. You, the reader, don't have to. Yeah. And this is hopefully what I've tried to do with this. So I've tried to collect. I hope that people who read what I've written will then get a much sort of more coherent idea of what happened in the Second World War and how the Holocaust happened.
Yeah. And how do you see?
Not how it happened, but what happened. I think more.
because it relates to, you know, what is Holocaust education, what has it achieved. I just interviewed Anita Lasker-Wallfisch
No.
10 days ago, and her point of view is like, we have done all this, we've interviewed, we've done, what has it brought to us? You know, has Holocaust education work? You know?
Well, okay, so the thing that is very important to understand is, I've just put this in a tactful way, people are not immensely well informed about lots of things, right? And one should contain one's expectation about how knowledgeable people are about lots of things. And that's not to patronise people. I remember hearing on the radio a plumber, and he'd come on the radio, he did a quiz, and the question he was asked was, who was the dictator of Italy while Hitler was the dictator of Germany? And he got as far as saying it was Musa something or other. That's what he said.
Yeah.
And he didn't know who Mussolini was. And so then he was told it was Mussolini. And his response was, well, you probably don't know where the stopcock is. And he's probably right. Okay. So I certainly couldn't give you a coherent description of how my central heating works. Everyone has their own knowledge, right? You can't expect everybody to have an incredible knowledge of the Holocaust, however much you teach it. It's just too much to expect. But what we should try to do is to make sure that well-informed people integrate that into their thinking, and that the information is available to anyone who wants to learn, and that some very basic ideas. Hitler was bad and killed a lot of Jews. I know that sounds, but that is important. I don't, and if I can get that across to people, and by the way, one of the things in my book, Stalin was also very bad and also killed a lot of people, and it's just important people get a grip of that. And I don't expect most people to end up knowing what Katyn was.
But do you think it will help, you know, with contemporary anti-Semitism? Because obviously that's now a topic which maybe wasn't a topic 20 years ago.
It was.
You know?
Yes, I think it still. I think it does help, and it does. We've got a growth of anti-Semitism, but we've also got a growth in the world of kind of understanding about racism. Those things are in tension. Sadly, I don't think we will ever eliminate prejudice or oppression or people killing each other because one person has a rabbit god and the other person's got an elephant god, right? People just do that. And I don't think we'll ever eliminate that, but we can contribute to it, and all you can do is contribute a little bit to it. And so I understand her sort of feeling of despair, but I think you'd give up altogether if you expect too much. And I just want to get across the idea is it's very dangerous if we go down the route of dictatorships because all these people got killed, right? And that would then, it's better if I can have people better informed than that. We should try, but if we can get that across to start off with, it would be good.
Okay, well, hopefully you'll achieve that. But what also is interesting, it seems there's more interest. There is maybe more anti-Semitism, but there's also more interest in the Holocaust. I don't know whether you find that.
Yeah,
you know,
completely.
There's so many
in fact,
books.
my mother said to me, so there was a number of things. First of all, one of the things that I wondered about with my book was, would the publishers all say, thank you very much for the idea, but do you have any other ideas? Because people have written all about this. And indeed, one of my friends that actually years ago, his agent said to him, he's a broadcaster, don't write about that. And everyone's writing about that. But that was totally not my experience. The publishers were absolutely falling over themselves to publish it. Quite seriously, it was very interesting. So, and they know what they're doing. So obviously they think people have got an interest in this and they will want to buy it. And that's very encouraging. People do have an interest in it. So obviously, by the way, we can achieve much more than rudimentary knowledge for educating people who read books. And that's obviously ought to be an objective, because teaching, intelligent, literate people some of the details of how and what happened is very important. My view is anyone who wants to understand what's happening in Israel, for example, and who wants a view on the Middle East, probably first ought to understand what happened to, the arguments my grandfather engaged in the 20s, where he thought he wouldn't, he wrote best-selling books saying he didn't think that creating a state in Israel would be necessary, and events rather changed his mind. So obviously, that kind of literacy is pretty important for politically engaged, literate people. But I think we're doing not badly with those people. I think that's, where I worry about more is a kind of general lack of understanding of the importance of the rule of law, really.
Which is a slightly different topic, but part of this.
No, it's part. The rule of law, I would say, is about the maintenance of a system that guarantees people's individual liberty as well as a democratic state.
Yeah, I mean, for example, not only the publication of the books, but also Holocaust Memorial Day. To me, it seems getting bigger and bigger. I'm just talking now UK, also worldwide, but it seems there are more institutions, more...
I used to joke to my mother that it was her busy season.
Yeah,
it's no question about it.
It just is interesting. Have you got any tips for any other second, third generation who want to write about their families now, based on your own research and your engagement?
So obviously, if you still can, please make sure that you try and record your parents in some form, preferably video. It's the best form. But if you can do it, if you can't, then do it writing it down. But okay, that's maybe too late for some people. The second thing I would say, which is very important, is that what happened to your parents happened to other people, and they have written about it. So if you know that your parents lived in a particular town, well, there are lots of other people who lived in that town, and you can find out all about that town, and what happened to them will have happened to other people. So, for example, in one of the characters in my book, he was shot in the Katyn massacre, which is explained in the book. But when people read it, they think to yourself, well, because he got shot, you think, how does anyone know? How do you know that's what happened to him? Because he was shot. And the answer is because it happened to several thousand people, and it all happened in the same way because someone wrote about that. Someone who did it wrote about it. So therefore, there's a record of it. So exactly what happened to each person, not individually, but as a group, is described. If you, I discovered what texture the carriages that took my mother from Belsen to Switzerland, that it was soft furnishing because somebody put it in their book. My mother didn't say it, but somebody else who was on the same train said it. So I suppose my biggest thing is, you've not lost the information if you haven't done the interview. What you need to do is think of the things that you know, and remember that if your parents lived in a certain town or they went to a certain concentration camp, or then what happened to other people when them were the same. And you can find a surprising amount of their story out of that. It's all in archives, in other people's books. You can piece it all together.
And also it creates interesting enough, sense of community. I mean, you have people, let's say, the descendants of Kitchener camp, I'm thinking where people were in the same
It's an extraordinary
camp, and there is a sort of legacy going on.
Yeah, we've got a friend, and she had a great aunt, I think, that had been in concentration camp, and that was a person that they thought of in their community. And we worked out that at different points she must have been in the same barrack as my mum. And so therefore, this was somebody that I knew here. Actually, Philippe Sands, I went to school, who wrote East West Street. I went to school with Philippe. We weren't in the same class, we were in different years. And Philippe, and we were cordial, but we were not particularly friends. We are now, we weren't not at the time. And in his book, East West Street, he talks about the Landers family of Lvov. Well, so do I in my book. It turns out we actually have the same, some common family. We think we're third cousins. Really? And that was an amazing, it was a very interesting discovery. So you discover this the whole time. And
you went to school together.
We've kind of embraced that. We're not 100% certain, but we've decided we are certain enough, and so we refer to each other as cousin and regard ourselves as relatives.
Okay, learned something new, interesting. Okay, almost lastly, do you feel the war in Ukraine and these current discussions about British immigration policy kind of resonate, especially to
Yes. So I don't. Let's take them. They're separate things.
you? Yeah, that.
So the war in Ukraine, obviously, bombs are literally falling on Lviv. In a place where I visited to see my father's house with Philippe. And one of the reasons that can happen is because of a concerted attempt by the Russians. The Russians didn't lose the war, unlike the Nazis. They were not forced to confront what happened to them. They all the things that the Nuremberg defendants were found guilty of, the Russians, the Soviets did all of them. Right, the Soviets were guilty of all of the crimes. They even tried to convict the Nuremberg defendants of the Katyn massacre, which they themselves had committed. Right, I've forgotten what was the question
About Philip Sounds with Ukraine.
Oh yeah,
Ukraine.
so because
Resonates.
yes, you'll have to somehow do
Don't
your
worry.
editing magic on that bit.
Don't worry.
So just it basically because of that, because the Soviets never had to have a reckoning because they won rather than lost the war. They can continue to distort their history of the area and continue to behave in an oppressive way to that area. Continue to pretend the things that did not happen, did not happen. And I think there's an obvious resonance of my book with what's happening in there in a direct way. It's at the same places, and anybody who wants to understand how certain parts of Ukraine became part of Ukraine can read the book and find that out. The British immigration policy is a more subtle thing. So my grandfather spent a lot of the war in New York. But one of the British decided at the end of the war they're not going to continue to fund his library, right? An incredibly short-sighted and stupid decision, but understandable when you take it in the context of all the other things they had going on. Right now, it seems like how could you not think that was a valuable resource? They hadn't even had the Nuremberg trials yet, and they were already saying we're not going to finance your archive of Nazi material, even though it then proved incredibly valuable, and there'd been no historical research on it. So it seems bonkers. But then you think to yourself, well, actually, there were millions of displaced people in the world. The whole world had been sort of burnt to the ground. So naturally, so you reach a bit more of an understanding of what happened. But my grandfather had that, and he yeah. So my grandfather had gone to America. He came back to this country, and because they weren't going to give him any money, they said you can have your period in the United States recognised as a period in Britain, and you're therefore eligible for citizenship. And that's how he became a citizen of this country. But at that point, there was a relatively limited number of people coming, and it was also part of a massive worldwide refugee problem, which had been caused by literal genocide in particular places. So both scale and immediacy were a bit different.
Yeah.
There's no question that their experience leads you to look at every person who wants to come through the lens of, are we denying somebody in immediate human need who wants to come here? But I look at every person thinking, I don't, however, have a duty to be in favour of all and every person who wants to immigrate to this country, because the scale is just simply different. And the immediacy is different in lots of cases, not in all, but in lots of cases. And where the immediacy is not different, i.e. Ukraine, this country has actually responded. So I would say that my position on this is like a lot of things, is sort of moderate. I think that people who have our experience and are therefore very open to the idea that this country needs to have safe and legal asylum, and it needs to protect asylum. And we've got a certain responsibility because of our background, I guess, to observe how important that was in the past, but I don't feel it. But I sometimes feel that people have got no responses to, well, what do we do about the fact that there are too many people who'd want to avail themselves of that, which there were not before, which we can't actually cope with. And at what point is that? It's quite tricky, right? Because you're then trading off people's immediate needs or even their legitimate desires with this country's own stability, right? And I've never felt it was reasonable to just ignore this country's own stability, because one of the things, this country was kind enough for me to take in my parents, and I don't want to say by that, because you took in my parents, I'm going to insist you take in everybody, right? That's sort of an odd position also. So it is just a very difficult issue. One of the things that we have got to accept in the world is there are too many refugees for every country that wants to take refugees to take them. But here's another point. People don't want to be refugees. So the thing that's informed me most is I very strongly believe in international aid. I very strongly want to support the international refugee effort. I very strongly support military intervention where necessary to protect democracies against illiberal forces and to prevent people becoming refugees in the first place, or to protect people who are refugees. That, in my view, is the first line. My grandfather didn't want to live in this country. He wanted to live in Germany. He was German. When he died, he has his funeral in German. Right? He said my funeral should be in German and Hebrew. On his coffin.
Do you know?
I do know, but I've now forgotten the name.
Salzburg? Georg Salzberger?
I don't think it was.
No, was it not?
But it was
One of the refugee rabbis.
Yeah. And he had on his coffin a wreath from the Federal Republic, and the ambassador was there, and the president issued a statement about my grandfather. He regarded, even though he was a naturalised Briton, he still had a strong association with Germany. He didn't want to be here, live here, be driven out. And what he wanted to do was to resist the Nazis in Germany. That's what he was trying to do. And so I guess my attitude to it is one step before. There's very little I wouldn't do to prevent people from becoming refugees. And that's how I deal. That's how I relate my experience to to refugees.
So I think just now with this whole Rwanda question, it has kind of
So by the way, I'm not in that. Don't get me wrong. I'm not in favour of that policy. Mainly because I don't think Rwanda is itself a safe and liberal place for refugees, and I don't think it's reasonable. And I'm also concerned that this country doesn't have a safe route for refugees. So I don't want what I'm saying to be translated as I'm in favour of the policy, but I do think that we all have to be kind of understanding and helpful over how we get how we ensure such a policy can be created that deals with that allows people to control their borders whilst still being humane.
Anything else I haven't asked you would like to add?
I don't think so.
Maybe how do you identify yourself then today? You're not second. You said not second generation. Any other?
Well, I would definitely call myself a British Jew. I always say that I'm the son of Holocaust survivor and son of a refugee from the Soviet Union. But I regard myself primarily as a kind of British journalist living in Pinner with my family. And that's how my parents would want me to think of myself.
Yeah. And do you have any message for anyone who might watch this interview in the future?
Well, I think there are a few things. Like, everyone should try and be kind to each other. My mother always used to say we all have our own mishigas, which for those people who don't know what that means, we all have our own craziness. We all have our own eccentricities. We should tolerate those in other people. We should try to defend that are vulnerable, because not everybody will be kind, even though we think people should be kind, and defend the rule of law, and also get things in proportion. That's my mother's most important message. So she would never have a row with somebody about a synagogue council. She never resigned from the synagogue council, or have a row with the neighbour about a tree. It was never important enough to her. So for some people, I suppose they saw Hitler and Stalin in everything, whereas my mother's approach was to see them in nothing. Right? Nothing was like that, and therefore we can get all of it in proportion. Since proportion is required in most things, I think if people could manage it a bit more, it would be a good thing. It's subjective, of course,
Yeah.
but it's still a good guide.
And that's what I remember. That's what she said, and she lived like that. She said she's not going to.
She did.
She wasn't bothered by.
She was never ever petty. So we once years later, she was the victim of some effectively theft from her, and this kind of manifested itself because one of the people working said to my sister that she'd not left enough food for the people who were working for her, and my sister was no. That definitely didn't happen. That's how we discovered that there was some theft going on, because that was impossible. My mother was never ever petty about things, and that was her takeaway from it. My father as well, which is be big-hearted, try and be big about things, try and be generous. Nothing's like Hitler and Stalin. It's not a competition. Allow people to live their lives, see things in proportion, be moderate in everything, try and be kind to each other, try and keep the law. Which my father was always very keen on, because he thought once we'd decided that we didn't have to keep them, why should anyone else? Then
Yeah. So and you're continuing at that.
well, look, you can. My parents, I can try. I only wish sometimes that I was, as capable of being equable as my mum was.
Okay, Danny. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.